Stevens Point Pine Cutover, Wisconsin, October 1948. The air, already sharp with the coming frost, carried the clang of metal on metal and the whir of a hand-cranked drill. On a small plot cleared from the jack pine and scrub oak, Stanislaw Wojcik was doing something no one had ever seen before. He was bolting 3 surplus military Quonset huts together, end to end, creating a single, 60-foot-long silver tube that snaked across his property. It looked less like a house and more like a metal caterpillar that had lost its way. From the dirt track that served as a road, Foster Reinhold, adjutant of the American Legion Post 6, watched with a practiced frown. He stood with his hands on his hips, his posture exuding the quiet authority of a man who understood regulations and the proper way of doing things. He turned to Silas Croft, who was leaning against the fender of his Ford pickup. "What in God's name does the Pole think he's doing?" Reinhold muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "That thing's 60 feet if it's an inch. Looks like a grounded Zeppelin." Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard he got him for scrap prices from the government. Still seems a foolish way to build. A tin can's no place to ride out a Wisconsin winter." Reinhold shook his head, his focus narrowing on a specific, more practical offense. "It's more than foolish, it's a violation. That structure crosses the boundary between 2 lots. Township ordinance is clear, 1 dwelling per plot, 15-foot setback from all lines. When the snow melts, the board's going to make him tear down 2/3 of his own house. The man's building himself a citation." The verdict was delivered with the flat certainty of a man who knew the rules. Stanislaw Wojcik was not just an eccentric, he was a fool, investing his scant resources into a home that was doomed before it was even finished. What did this Polish-American Army Air Corps mechanic, a man who'd spent the war on sun-scorched Pacific islands, understand about the brutal physics of a sectioned thermal buffer that a lifetime of local log cabin builders had missed? Before we discover the answer, and I promise you, it is an answer rooted in simple, elegant physics that will change how you think about staying warm, I want to ask you to do something. If you believe in the power of quiet genius and the satisfaction of seeing conventional wisdom proven wrong, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. I promise you will learn something fundamental today about how heat actually moves and how simple, overlooked structures can achieve extraordinary results. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen a Quonset hut used as a home, and what did you think of it? Stanislaw Wojcik was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a farmer, the foundational professions of Portage County. His hands were not trained to the heft of an axe or the grain of a pine log. He was a mechanic. By trade, a specialist in the Army Air Corps, 9th Troop Carrier Squadron. His world had been the hot, humid air of Pacific Island airfields, the smell of aviation gas and hot metal. His tools were wrenches, rivet guns, and torque specifications. His materials were aluminum sheeting, steel ribs, and the ingenious channel tie plates that could join modular structures into a unified whole, strong enough to resist the sheer force of a typhoon. He thought in systems, not in single objects. He didn't see a hut, he saw a component. He and his wife, Elżbieta, and their 2 small children, Jan and Zofia, had come to the Wisconsin cutover the year before, in 1947. They came with the hope of land, a piece of America to call their own, bought with Stanislaw's service pay. They spent their first winter in a hastily constructed shack, a single-walled affair of green lumber and tar paper that was little more than a box to hold the cold. That winter was a brutal education. Stanislaw learned what cold really was, not as a number on a thermometer, but as a physical presence, an invasive force that broke things. He watched the neighbor's new pickup battery, a heavy black Exide, crack its own casing as the acid cells inside froze solid and expanded. He saw Elżbieta, dressing for a rare trip to town, pull on a pair of precious nylon stockings, only to have them snap at the toe with a sound like a dry twig breaking, the very fibers made brittle by the relentless freeze. The most unsettling lesson came one evening during a particularly bitter cold snap. The family was huddled around the radio, listening to the world beyond their frozen clearing, when a tiny, molten bead of metal dripped from the back of the console and sizzled on the floorboards. The extreme cold had caused the metal chassis to contract so severely that it squeezed a drop of solder from a vacuum tube pin. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside the very objects of their lives, changing their nature, breaking them from within. That night, with Jan coughing in his sleep and Zofia bundled in every blanket they owned, Stanisław vowed they would not spend another winter as victims of the cold. They would spend the next one inside a machine designed to defeat it. The conventional wisdom of the Wisconsin frontier was written in logs. A proper house was a cabin, built from the plentiful pine of the cutover, chinked with mud and moss. These houses were monuments to labor, their thick walls suggesting permanence and warmth. But they were a lie. They were energy sieves, thermodynamic failures on a massive scale. The problem wasn't the logs themselves, it was the way they were used. A standard cabin was a single-layer defense against an enemy with infinite reserves. The physics were simple and brutal. Heat moves from hot to cold, and the greater the temperature difference, the delta T, the faster it moves. On a January night, the inside of a cabin might be 60 degrees Fahrenheit, kept there by a roaring wood stove. The outside air might be 20 below zero. That 80-degree difference created a powerful thermal gradient, and the heat inside the cabin poured through the solid logs via conduction, desperately seeking equilibrium with the Arctic air. The chinking failed. The single-pane windows frosted over, then grew a thick, opaque layer of ice. The cold didn't just find the cracks, it soaked into the very substance of the walls. The immense thermal mass of the logs, which might have been an asset in a milder climate, became a liability. Once they were cold-soaked, they radiated cold into the living space, actively stealing warmth from the air and from the bodies of the people inside. You could see the failure at the Miller place, a quarter-mile down the track. John Miller was a strong, capable man who had built his cabin with his own two hands. It was a fine-looking structure, square and true, but every winter it demanded a punishing tithe of fuel. His family burned nearly a cord of wood a week, a frantic, constant battle to feed the stove. The heat went straight up the chimney or into the logs, and out into the night. They lived in a small bubble of warmth a few feet from the cast-iron stove, while the corners of their single room were cold enough to store meat. They woke up to ice on the inside of their walls, a delicate, beautiful filigree of frozen condensation that was a testament to their home's inability to protect them. Their house was not a shelter, it was a battleground, and they were slowly losing the war of attrition against the cold. The very sturdiness of the log cabin was a trap, a massive, uninsulated sink that bled BTUs into the frozen landscape. Stanisław's project began not with an axe, but with a catalog. He found a government surplus dealer in Milwaukee selling off thousands of demobilized military assets. Among them were Type S1 Quonset huts, the 20 by 48 foot models, for $75 apiece. He bought 3. They arrived on a flatbed truck, a puzzle of curved steel ribs and corrugated sheets. To the neighbors, it was a pile of expensive scrap. To Stanisław, it was a system. First, he built the foundation. Not a slab, not a stone wall, but simple timber crib work, piers of squared-off logs that lifted the entire structure a foot off the ground. This was his first break with tradition. A cabin sat on the earth, drawing its cold. Stanisław's structure would float above it. Then came the assembly, a process that mystified and amused the onlookers. He laid out the steel base channels, the U-shaped tracks that formed the footprint of the huts. But instead of laying 3 separate foundations, he laid one continuous 60-foot line. At the points where one 20-foot hut would end and the next would begin, he did something no one had seen before. He overlapped the base channels and bolted them together using heavy-gauge steel plates, the channel tie plates he knew from his days fighting typhoons in the Pacific. These plates, designed to distribute wind load across multiple structural members, now served a new purpose. They physically and legally unified the 3 shells into a single, contiguous building. He and Elżbieta, working together with a simple block and tackle, raised the steel ribs, bolting them to the base channels. Then they began fastening the corrugated steel sheets, a long, repetitive task filled with the metallic screech of the drill and the satisfying chunk of bolts being tightened. The structure grew, a long, segmented arch of raw, galvanized steel gleaming in the autumn sun. Foster Reinhold made it a point to stop by regularly, his concern a thin veneer over his disapproval. "That thing's over 60 feet long, Wojciech," he stated one afternoon, gesturing with his thumb at the sprawling structure. He'd brought Gus Muller, the town's butcher, with him for support. "Straddles 2 plots by my measure. Township ordinance says 1 dwelling per plot, with a 15-foot setback from all lines. I'm just giving you fair warning. They're going to make you tear it down come spring." Stanislav paused, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He walked to the junction between the first and second huts and tapped his wrench against the thick steel plate binding the 2 base channels together. "Is 1 building," he said, his English deliberate and precise. He pointed to the single chimney flue he was installing in the center hut. 1 foundation, 1 flue, 1 house. He then turned and went back to tightening a bolt. The conversation, for him, concluded. Reinhold and Muller exchanged a look of exasperated pity. The man was stubborn. He was building his own financial ruin, and he wouldn't even listen to a friendly warning. Elżbieta watched from the doorway of their old shack, her expression a mixture of profound trust and practical worry. "It looks like a great silver worm, Stas," she said that evening, as they ate a simple meal of potatoes and sausage. The children were already asleep. "A beautiful, strange worm. Will it be warm for Jan and Zofia?" Stanislaw reached across the small table and covered her hand with his. His hands were calloused and stained, but his touch was gentle. "It will be warm," he promised. "The cold will not get in. Not this year." He wasn't guessing. He was a mechanic, and he had read the blueprints of the winter. He knew the enemy's strategy, and he had designed a machine to counter it. The mockery from the men in town was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. They saw 3 tin cans bolted together. They saw thin, uninsulated walls and imagined a frost-covered tomb. They saw a fool. Stanislaw saw a 3-stage heat exchanger. The problem with a conventional cabin wasn't the cold itself. The problem was that the cabin fought the entire war on a single front. It pitted its warmest interior air directly against the coldest exterior air, creating a massive thermal differential that drove rapid heat loss. Stanislaw's design refused to fight that battle. It broke the war into 3 smaller, manageable skirmishes. Think of it like this. It's like wearing 3 thin shirts instead of 1 thick, heavy coat. The magic isn't in the material of the shirts. It's in the layers of air trapped between them. Stanisław's 60-foot compound was a series of nested thermal envelopes. The outermost hut, Hut 1, was the sacrificial layer. It was essentially a large, unheated, enclosed porch. It faced the brutal north wind. Its purpose was not to be warm, but to be still. When the Arctic Express blew at 25 miles per hour and the air temperature was 32 below zero, the wind chill was a devastating 60 degrees below zero. That wind was a relentless thief, stripping BTUs from any surface it touched, But the moment that air passed through the simple wooden door into Hut 1, it was captured. It was still 32 below, but its velocity was gone. The wind chill was eliminated. The first and most violent stage of the attack was neutralized. Hut 1's job was to kill the wind. The middle hut, Hut 2, was the primary living space. This was where Stanislav installed the single, small 5 centimeters, 5 small wood stove. This hut's enemy was not the 30 degrees of maelstrom outside. Its enemy was the calm, 0 degrees of air held within Hut 1. Heat from the stove would leak through the simple canvas gangway connecting the two huts, but the temperature difference was now only about 65 degrees, from 65 degree Fs in Hut 2 to 0 degree F in Hut 1, not the 97-degree gap to the outside world. He had effectively cut the thermal pressure on his main living space by a third. The steel walls of Hut 2 radiated their warmth not into the screaming wind, but into the static, captive air of the outer shell. The innermost hut, Hut 3, was the sanctum. This was the kitchen and the sleeping quarters. It was connected by another canvas gangway to the warm Hut 2. This hut fought no war with the winter at all. Its only thermal enemy was the 65-degree air of the living room. The temperature difference between the 72-degree sleeping area and the 65-degree living area was a mere 7 degrees. The heat loss was trivial. It was a cascade. Each shell broke the thermal gradient, passing on a less difficult challenge to the next. The outer hut took the full, brutal force of the Arctic. The middle hut fought a mild, windless cold. The inner hut barely fought at all. It simply existed in a state of protected, stable warmth. The numbers from the card were not optimistic guesses. They were the predictable result of the physics. Each shell would dissipate roughly 50% of the remaining heat loss. With a single, modestly burning stove, Stanislav calculated he could maintain a 70-degree Thero's core temperature in Hut 3 even when the outside temperature plunged to near 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He had built a fortress, not of thickness, but of intelligence. That December, the winter came not as a gradual cooling, but as an invasion. The radio called it a Wisconsin Arctic Express, a southbound polar front that descended from Canada and locked the state in a deep freeze. For 9 consecutive days, the temperature at Stevens Point never rose, above 20 degrees, and at night it plunged to 32 degrees. A relentless 25-mile-per-hour north wind scoured the landscape, piling snow into deep, sculpted drifts and driving the effective temperature into the realm of true danger. Wood piles, left uncovered, became monolithic blocks of frozen timber, the logs welded together with ice, forcing men to use splitting mauls just to break free a few pieces for the stove. It was a winter that tested every assumption and broke every poorly made thing. At the Miller cabin, the fight was desperate. The windows were opaque with an inch of ice. John and his wife, Mary, took turns feeding the pot-bellied stove, which glowed a dull red, consuming seasoned oak at an alarming rate. The family lived in a cramped circle of misery around it, wrapped in coats and blankets. When John went to the water bucket by the door to get a drink, he had to break a skim of ice on the surface first. The cold was winning. It was inside the house with them. At the Wojcik compound, a different reality was unfolding. Stanislav monitored the temperatures with a mechanic's precision. Outside, the thermometer read 32 degrees, and the wind howled around the curved steel shell. He opened the door to Hut 1, the outer shell. The air inside was instantly, shockingly still. The temperature was a frigid 5 degrees, but the silence from the wind was profound. It felt like walking into a vast, cold cathedral. He passed through the canvas gangway into Hut 2, the living area. The warmth was immediate and gentle, a soft embrace. The small stove radiated a steady, comfortable heat, the air holding at a pleasant 65 degrees. Here Jan was lying on a rug, reading a comic book. Then, Stanislav passed through the final gangway into Hut 3, the core. The air here was warmer still, a toasty 72 degrees. It smelled of coffee and the faint, sweet scent of yeast, and there, on the floor, was the ultimate proof, the image that defied the entire logic of a Wisconsin winter. His daughter, Zofia, sat on the bare wooden floorboards, dressed in a simple cotton shirt and trousers, her socks-clad feet tucked beneath her as she drew a picture of a house, a long, silver one, on a piece of butcher paper. While the children in the log cabins down the road were shivering in their coats, Zofia was living as if it were a mild autumn day. That evening, Elżbieta prepared the dough for pierogi, a taste of the old country and a comfort in the new one. She mixed the flour, eggs, and water, kneading the soft, pliant mass on a floured board. In any other house in Portage County that night, that bowl of dough would have become a cold, dense, lifeless lump. Yeast, a living organism, requires warmth to work its magic. Cold stuns it into inactivity. Elżbieta placed the bowl on a small table in the corner of Hut 3, covered it with a cloth, and went about her other chores. The house was a quiet, warm bubble of life surrounded by a universe of crystalline cold. The vindication came on the 7th day of the freeze, delivered fittingly by Foster Reinhold. He was out on Legion business, a charity drive to deliver food baskets and check on the welfare of the area's more isolated veterans and their families. His Ford pickup, which had been protesting the cold for days with agonizingly slow cranks, finally gave up. He was less than a quarter mile from the Wojcik place when the engine died with a final, pathetic cough. When he tried to restart it, there was nothing. Silence. He knew what it meant. The battery was frozen. The cold had claimed another victim. Shivering, he and the Legionnaire with him, a young man named Peterson, got out and began the miserable task of pushing the truck. The only light visible in the gathering dusk was the faint yellow glow from the direction of the strange Quonset compound. "Let's see if the pole has a phone," Reinhold said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Or at least a cup of hot coffee." They trudged through the snow, their boots crunching loudly in the frozen silence. They knocked on the plain wooden door of the first hut. Stanislav opened it. He recognized Reinhold and nodded, stepping back to let them in. Reinhold stepped inside, and the first shock hit him. It wasn't warmth. It was the absolute total stillness. The wind, which had been a constant howling pressure against his ears and face for a week, was gone. The air was painfully cold, but it was dead calm. He could feel his ears begin to ache as they adjusted to the silence. "My truck, battery," Reinhold managed, his jaw stiff with cold. "Come," Stanislav said simply, gesturing for them to follow. He led them toward the canvas curtain at the far end of the frigid, dark space. He pulled the canvas aside and Reinhold stepped through into Hut 2. The warmth hit him not as a gentle wave, but as a solid wall. It was a physical force that made him stop in his tracks. His frozen cheeks began to prickle and burn. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, took in the scene. A small, tidy living space, warmly lit by an oil lamp, the air a comfortable, breathable temperature. He saw a child on the floor reading. It was a scene of impossible domestic tranquility. "Coffee is in the kitchen," Stanislav said, already moving toward the next canvas doorway. "My wife is making." This was the moment that broke Foster Reinhold's certainty. He followed Stanislav, his mind struggling to process the information his senses were delivering. He stepped through the second gangway into Hut 3, the innermost sanctum. He was fully expecting this back room of a tin shack to be an icebox, a place where his breath would hang in the air. He braced himself for the familiar, biting cold of a poorly heated Wisconsin home. Instead, the air that greeted him was soft, humid, and smelled of yeast and brewing coffee. It was warmer in this back room than it was in his own kitchen, which was attached to a massive, roaring furnace. He stood there, stunned into silence. he saw Elżbieta Wojcik standing at a wooden table, her sleeves rolled up. She was humming softly as she deftly rolled out a thin sheet of pale, pliant dough. On the table next to her sat the bowl, the cloth cast aside, revealing the source of the yeasty smell. The dough had risen, doubling in size, its surface a perfect smooth dome. It was alive, active, thriving. In a county where every other woman's dough was a cold gray ball of failure, Elżbieta Wojcik was preparing a feast. Reinhold's gaze moved from the impossible dough to Elżbieta's comfortable expression, to the single, modest stovepipe he could glimpse through the gangways, venting from the middle hut. He looked at Stanisław, who was simply waiting, offering no explanation, no, "I told you so." Reinhold, a man of rules and ordinances, of proven methods and established facts, felt the entire foundation of his worldview crack. He, in his sturdy, respectable, wood-framed house, was cold. His truck was a frozen lump of steel. His world was failing. This quiet man, in his ridiculous tin caterpillar, was living in a pocket of summer. He finally found his voice, but the words that came out were not an apology. They were a revelation, a sudden, profound understanding of what he was seeing. He looked at Stanisław, his eyes wide with a respect that bordered on awe. "My God, Wojcik," he said, his voice quiet, "you didn't build a house, you built a harbor." At the next meeting of the American Legion Post 6, Foster Reinhold did not speak of setback ordinances or building code violations. He stood before the assembled veterans, men who had survived Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Bulge, and he told them about pierogi dough. He described walking into a bubble of warmth so profound it felt like another climate. He told them about a family living in shirt sleeves while the rest of the county froze in their coats. He spoke with the conviction of a convert. He proposed that the Post Bulletin, a simple mimeographed newsletter that usually announced potlucks and membership dues, publish the specifications for Stanisław Wojcik's three-hut compound. There was some debate, but Reinhold's testimony was powerful. These were practical men, and results were a language they understood. The motion passed. In the February 1949 edition of the Post 6 Bulletin, between a notice for a fish fry and a list of new members, was a single page with a hand-drawn diagram. It showed 3 Quonsets, the dimensions for the crib work, and the critical detail of the channel tie plates. It was titled simply, Wojcik's Method. That spring and summer, a change came to the cutover. The laughter had stopped. Now, there was imitation. By the time the first snows of the next winter fell, 6 other families, all of them WW2 veterans who knew Quonsets from their own service, had built their own 3-hut compounds along the Wisconsin River. The landscape was dotted with the long silver arches, no longer symbols of eccentricity, but of a new, hard-won wisdom. The fuel savings were staggering. Men who had burned 10 cords of wood to survive a winter now found they needed only 3. The idea was spreading, passed not through architectural journals, but through a community bulletin and the quiet testimony of men who had felt the warmth with their own hands. Stanisław Wojcik, with surplus steel and a mechanic's logic, had anticipated by decades the core principles of modern high-performance building. What he had created was, in essence, a rudimentary form of the air-gapped thermal break and the layered envelope, concepts that would later be championed by building science in movements like the Passive House standard. He had no formal training in thermodynamics, but he had an intuitive grasp of systems, an immigrant's desperate need for a solution, and a mechanic's refusal to accept that a problem could not be solved with the materials at hand. He had built not just a home, but a prototype. The true brilliance of Stanisław's design was not in its materials, which were cheap and common, nor in its appearance, which was alien to the landscape. It was in the relationship he created between the parts. A single log cabin stands alone against the winter, a solitary soldier on a vast, frozen battlefield, doomed to a slow defeat. Wojciech's design was different. It was a system of mutual support. He didn't build one house to fight the winter. He taught 3 borrowed humble shells how to brace each other, how to share their burdens, and how to pool their warmth against the killing cold. It was a lesson in physics, but it was also a lesson in community, written in 60 feet of corrugated steel. If this story of quiet genius and practical wisdom resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten innovators. We believe these histories are worth saving and sharing. Let us know in the comments below. What other simple, brilliant solutions from the past have you seen or heard of that have been overlooked by time? Your insights help us all learn. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, inspired by real historical practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The techniques described are based on historical accounts of frontier ingenuity. Anyone attempting to apply similar principles in a modern context should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.